Hey everyone, my name is Anson. Today I'm going to teach you all how to write unit tests in React for your Next.js application. So the project that we will be setting up is a simple Next.js application, and I'll show you how to set up Jest as well as React testing library, so that way you all can start writing unit tests. Before we even write unit tests, let's understand what exactly are unit tests and why they are very, very important in software development. Unit tests are pretty much just tests that you write for your application that test individual components or individual pieces of code in your application. So rather than testing your whole application as a whole, you're taking small little chunks of your code, breaking them down into little pieces and writing tests. The reason why this is important is because you want to make sure that individual components of your product work as intended. And if they don't, that gives you lots of feedback and it helps you isolate problems. And down the road, it will help you detect bugs and make it a lot easier to refactor things, fix any possible bugs. And it just also gives you more confidence as you are developing your application. Because let's say maybe you might have a component that starts off small and you write some unit tests for it. As you are implementing new features for that component, maybe those new features could possibly break the existing test, and that could give you feedback. It can either tell you maybe the unit test that you wrote was not as effective as it should be, or perhaps the new features or the features that you're modifying could be a deal breaker if it is breaking the test. So it's a good way to get feedback when you are developing your application. It also allows you to verify the functionality, of course, verify the functionality of your component, and you don't have to constantly, go into the browser and input manual data over and over again, because you're pretty much writing automated tests that will keep on testing and giving you feedback over and over again. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is that many of you might be wondering, well, shouldn't we also be writing tests that test the whole application? Why would we only want to test one component? And that's a good analysis. Yes, you do want to also test the whole application, and those types of tests are called end-to-end tests. There's also integration tests where you test multiple components together and see how they behave with each other. End-to-end tests typically focus on testing the front to back end. So in those situations, you actually have the front end interacting with the API, and the API interacts with a real database. So it's pretty much as if a real customer was using the application. Okay, in software development, developers typically write unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. You don't just only write unit tests or end-to-end tests. You typically pair those two together. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. As we progress through this tutorial, you will actually see many examples of how we write unit tests, specifically with React projects, and you will better understand how to integrate that into your project. So one thing that I will also mention is, although we are using Next.js for our framework, the setup for really any React project is the same. So if you're using something like Vite to set up your React project, there are different tools that you can use, such as Vite to set up testing for your project. However, all of the concepts, such as using Jest, using React testing library, it's the same exact thing. The only difference is just setting up one or two things a little bit differently. Okay, and those tools that you use, so for example, if you use Vite, they have documentation on how to set up Jest, how to set up React testing library. So I encourage you to look into that. However, since Next.js is a very, very, very popular framework, I figured this would be a good idea to use Next.js in this tutorial. Okay, so now that we have gone through a little brief introduction of what exactly is unit testing, let's go ahead and jump right into setting up our project. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go into my terminal, and I'm inside my Documents Unit Testing Projects folder. And what I'll do is I'll generate a Next.js project. So I'll type npx create next app or create hyphen next hyphen app at latest. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and name this project React Unit Tests JS. And for this project, I'm not going to use TypeScript. However, if you do know TypeScript, you can very easily translate everything. But I will show you all how to set up a project in TypeScript because it is a little bit different. Okay, so I will select no for this project. Then I will show you how to set up the TypeScript version. Would you like to use ESLint? Yes, I do. Would you like to use Tailwind? No. If you don't want to use ESLint, you don't have to. But I'm just going to set that up just because I want to show you all good practices. I will go ahead and hit yes for this one. Use the app router. I'll just hit yes. It's not going to really make much of a difference. And I'll select no for this, for the customizing the default import alias. So this will go ahead and generate our project. And what I'll do first is I'll set up the JavaScript project. And then after we're done, I'll set up the TypeScript project. And of course, I'll leave timestamps so you guys can just skip ahead if you don't want to watch a certain section. And like I said before, the only difference between the JavaScript and TypeScript setup is really just the setup. The way that you write the test, it's going to be the same exact way. You might get some typing issues, but of course, those who use TypeScript probably are familiar with handling that. I just want to make sure that I am, catering to both the JavaScript people who only know JavaScript and the people who know TypeScript and only want to use TypeScript, and they want to figure out how to set up the project with TypeScript, because I know that's a huge deal breaker. And sometimes, not knowing how to set up certain things in a TypeScript specific project can make or break someone, someone's decision on wanting to use TypeScript or not. So I'm just mentioning that. Okay, so enough talking. Let's go into our project right now. I'm going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code. Okay, a very, very standard Next.js project right over here. So let's go ahead and set up everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install 4 dependencies for my JavaScript, JavaScript-based Next.js project. I'm going to install them as dev dependencies. So I'll type npm i-d, and I'm going to install Jest, which is a testing framework that we're going to use to actually write the tests. I'm going to install another package called jest-environment-jsdom. This is for actually being able to write tests that work in the browser, okay? Because we are working in the browser, not in Node.js, so we want to make sure we have the JSDOM context, okay? I'm also going to install React testing library. So @testing-library/React, okay? And then I'm going to also install the JSDOM package that comes from React testing library. So @testing-library, not JSDOM, sorry, JSDOM is what I meant to say. JSDOM. And this gives us the ability to have additional matchers. So by default, Jest does not come with certain matchers that we can use to write assertions. So one of the common ones that we'll use is called to be in the document, which comes from just-dom. Okay, so I'm going to install all of these dependencies. And while that is installing, because it will take some time, I'm going to jump right into the Next.js docs, and I will provide a link so you all can see this. But I'm just going to go into the Jest and React testing library section. And of course, you can see that these are all the dependencies that we are installing right over here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this part, and I'll explain what's going on here. And we're going to need to create this file manually, jest.config.mjs. Okay, so let's go into here, jest.config.mjs. And let's go ahead and copy this code, and we'll import this. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're just importing Next.js, which is a function that comes from the Next.js package. And this pretty much sets up a lot of stuff underneath the hood. You can read more about this on documentation if you want. They give you some bullet points that talks about what they do. I'm not going to go over all of it. I'm just explaining what we're doing here. And then right over here, this is the important part. This is the actual Jest config. So notice how we have the test environment property. If you are familiar with Jest, you recognize this 100%. Okay, notice how it's set to Jest environment JS DOM and not node. Okay, and you need to make sure you have Jest environment JS DOM installed. Okay, so if you want to set up other stuff, you would do that inside this config object. And if you aren't familiar with what types of properties you can set up, you can very easily just go to the Just.js.io website, and you can look. You can click on API, and you can look for configuring Jest, and they should give you all the possible properties that you can pass in there. So, for example, if I wanted to, let's say if I wanted to modify something, maybe like the root directory, I can do that. So I can pass in something like root dir, okay, and I can pass in, you know, the directory that I want it to point to. But I'm not going to do that for now. But what I will do is I will uncomment this line over here, set up files after env, and we want this to be present because what we want to do is we want to have some code executed. We want to have some code executed after we set up everything. So you can see that it's going to point to this just.setup.js file, which we do not have yet, but that's the next step is we're going to create that file inside our root directory. So right over here, I'm going to create a new file called just.setup.js. Okay, and before we continue, that's really all that's going on inside this file, and it then just calls this create just config function, and it just export that as a default. And so it'll use this, Next.js will use this underneath the hood and set up everything for us. Okay, so inside this just.setup.js file, we're going to import the just DOM package that we installed that comes from React testing library, and you can see that is right over here. And what we're doing is we're just extending expect, which by default we do not have certain matchers, but we want to have additional custom matchers. So we want to make sure we import that inside just.setup.js. So I'll copy that right now and paste that here. So this will give me access to a bunch of additional tools that we normally won't have. Okay, last but not least, I will go ahead and set up a test file or test script inside the package.json file. So this will just be a test, and then it'll just execute the just binary. You can also set up a watch script as well. So I'll do test:watch, and this will just be just --, passing the watch all flag. Okay. And we're not done yet. The last thing that I will do, and this is totally optional. If you do not set up ESLint, you can just skip the step, but I do recommend you all set up ESLint because it really does enforce good practices. So I'll show you the two plugins that we're going to use. Okay, and I'll provide links in the description if you want to read more about this. So we're going to install ESLint plugin testing library, and we're also going to install ESLint plugin just DOM. So these two plugins pretty much allow you to follow best practices, and it pretty much allows you to avoid common mistakes when you're writing tests, which is very, very helpful. Because if you write poor tests, it can really bottleneck your tests a lot, and we want to make sure we're following good practices. Okay, so all we're going to do is just install these two dependencies. So like I said, if you did not set up ESLint, you can just skip this part, but I'm going to install them as dev dependencies. So npm i-d ESLint plugin testing library. So that's ESLint plugin testing library, and then we want to install the one for just DOM as well. So let's install those two, and then we'll just set them up real quick. So it's pretty simple. We're just going to go inside our existing .eslintrc.json file that was generated by Next.js. But if you did not set up ESLint, then you'll need to make sure you install ESLint and then create your own ESLint config file. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this part and just pass this inside an array because we are extending multiple different plugins. So the first one that I'll do is we want to, there should be a recommended setup. Yep, so that's this one right over here, plugin testing library React. And just letting you all know that the code will be in the description, so you all will be able to just clone the repository and use that to follow along in case if you're having trouble, like, you know, copying and pasting all these config stuff. Like, I know the configuration part is, you know, sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating, so that's the reason why I'm providing the source code for you all. But all we're going to do is just pass these two additional strings inside this array. So now we have extended our ESLint to use these plugins. Okay, so that is pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward. So now let's go ahead and just exit out of here. And we're done setting up our project. So very quickly, what I will do, just to show you all how this works, is I'll create a tests folder, and I'll create a simple test file. So since we're inside a JavaScript project, I'll create a index.test.jsx file, and I'll use describe hello, hello, and if everything works, we should not get any errors. So I'll execute that test script that I created. So npm run test. And if there's anything wrong with the setup, it will tell us right over here. But since there was nothing wrong, it passed the test, which is good. So I can do something like expect 1 to be 1. And everything should work just fine. And we should not have any issues with rendering components. But before we do any of that stuff, I want to show everyone how to set up the TypeScript version of this. So that way, both people who use TypeScript and people who use JavaScript can follow along. So I'm going to go ahead and get to that part. All right, so this next part is going to be pretty much identical. So we're going to go ahead and create a Next.js project, but this time we're going to use TypeScript. So npx create next app at latest, and I'm just going to call this unit tests React TS. And I'll select yes for TypeScript. For ESLint, I'll select yes. Tailwind, I'll select no. Select yes for source directory. Use the app router, doesn't matter. And this one doesn't really matter. So we'll generate the project. Okay. And while that is happening, we are going to get ready to install all of the dependencies that we'll need. Okay. There we go. So let's go ahead and cd into this folder. So unit tests React TS, cd unit tests React TS. Okay, let's open up this project real quick. Okay, again, pretty straightforward stuff. Just the only difference is TypeScript files. Okay, so let's go back into our terminal. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and install. So npm i-d, we're going to install Jest. We're going to install Jest environment JS. So all of these same dependencies that we installed previously in the JavaScript project, we'll install in the TypeScript project. We're going to install React testing library. So at testing-library / jest-dom. Or I'm sorry, that's the Jest DOM. I typed that one first. But this is the actual React testing library package. Okay, so these are all of the 4 packages that we're going to install first. Okay, once we are done installing that, we're going to install a couple of other dependencies. We're going to install TS-Jest, which is just a TypeScript processor for Jest. Okay, since we are using a TypeScript project, so we'll do npm i-d ts-jest. Okay. And I will also install one more thing. This is completely optional, ts node. Okay, and I will also install those two ESLint plugins. So that's ESLint plugin just DOM and ESLint plugin testing library, just like that. Okay. All right, so let's go back into our project. Let's first set up a test script. So this will just be jest, and then test watch, just watch all. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to set up the config file. So you can do this two ways. You can either just generate it using the just binary, but I'm just gonna manually create it. So we'll do just config. Now, one thing that I will mention is that in the example they use, I think, an MJS file in the JavaScript version, but we can actually just use a TS file. And if you want this to work, you do need TS node. If you don't have TS node, it'll complain about it. So you do need TS node. That's why I said it's optional. But if you don't want to use TS node, if you don't want to install TS node, you can just change this to just.config.mjs instead. Okay, so just want to throw that out there. Just go back over here. Okay, so yeah, all we're gonna do is really just copy all this stuff over here, the same thing that we worked with in the JavaScript project. So it's going to import all of this stuff over here. Okay, but what I'll do is I'll go down here. I'm going to uncomment this part because we need this part. Okay, it's the same exact stuff, but now since we're using TypeScript, we need to make sure we set the preset to tsjust. Okay, and that was a dependency that we installed. Okay, and that is pretty much all we need to do. Now that we're done with that, let's go ahead and set up the same file that we did, just setup.js. And this is just going to import that testing library just DOM extend expect. So that way we have the extended matchers that we can use. Okay, and I believe the last thing that we need to do is just set up the ESLint stuff. So I'll just copy and paste all the stuff that we had from before. It's the same thing. It's language agnostic, and we're done. So let's go ahead and test everything out. So let's create a new folder, __ tests, and let's create a simple test file. So all test files have to match either .test.tsx or .test.jsx or .spec.tsx or .spec.jsx. I'll talk more about that later once we finish the setup stuff. So let's just do it should. Okay, and then we'll just do expect 1 to be 1. And let's just run the test to make sure everything works. So npm run test. Okay. So pretty much we know that it works. And before I exit this part, I do want to mention a couple things. So you can see that we have you can see that we have the custom to be in the document matcher right over here, and that comes from testing library just DOM, which is what we imported inside this just setup.js file. Okay. Another thing that I will also mention is that sometimes you might have issues with IntelliSense not being able to pick up some of the imports that come from testing library. So for example, render is a function that comes from testing library. That's totally fine. We can just manually import this from the React testing library package. So import render from @testing library React, and now it should appear there. So I can import render and screen, which are two utilities that we'll be using to write tests. Okay, so at this point, now that we're finished setting up both the JavaScript and the TypeScript project, it doesn't really matter which language you use because realistically they're all the same thing. The only difference really is you're probably going to deal with some typing issues if you are using things that are statically typed. But just to make things simple, I will go back to the JavaScript project. But those of you who have set up this project using TypeScript, or if you have a TypeScript project and you add this to your setup, you can still follow along. It's all the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and exit this part out, and I'm going to go back into the JavaScript project. And like I said, both of these repositories will be uploaded to GitHub, so that way every single one of you will be able to use it as a reference. All right, so I know we just spent about 30 minutes going over the whole setup, but I didn't want to cut any corners. So now that we have finished setting up everything, let's go ahead and start writing tests. So this is our Next.js project. We're not really going to worry about the home page right now. What I'll do is I'll just show you a simple example of how we can actually write a quick test. So what I'll do is I'll delete all this stuff over here, okay? And even though we are working with pages, they are still considered React components, okay? So the way that you render them, it's the same exact thing. So what we'll do inside this home page component is I'll just write a simple header, h1, and I'll just say home page, just like that. Okay, so now when I visit this page, I should see home page. Okay, well, let's write a simple test for this home component. So now here's the question, right? What exactly do we want to test? So now when it comes to writing tests, you have to actually think about the type of tests that you want to write. You have to think about what exactly you want to test for. Because the whole purpose of React Testing Library is to focus on behavioral testing. So you're focusing on what the customer sees whenever they visit the page, whenever they interact with components, when they type text into input fields, when they click on buttons, when they navigate to different pages. That is the philosophy of React Testing Library, and you can read about it on the website, right? The creator of React Testing Library, Kent C. Dodds, designed that library with this intent. Compared to other libraries in the past, like Enzyme, which focused a lot on implementation details, such as, state, how a function is being called, all that kind of stuff. We don't want to worry about that kind of stuff. We want to worry about what the user is actually seeing. How the user interacts with the document, how they interact with their components is what we care about. Okay, so for example, what the user sees. Well, the user should see the homepage text. So what we could do is we can write a simple test to verify that that homepage text is actually in the document. So let's write our first test. So earlier I created this __tests __ folder. And inside this folder, what I'll do is I will create a new file and I'll just call this homepage.test. Okay, you can either do a .test or .spec extension and then end it with .jsx if you're using JavaScript. If you're using TypeScript, you can have it end with .tsx. I personally like using the .test.jsx extension, so we'll go with that. Doesn't really matter. So let's go ahead and write our first test. So to write your first test using just in React Testing Library, what we can do first is we can set up a test suite using the describe function. And this is just a way for you to categorize all of your tests in one single suite. So what I'll do is I'll just say homepage rendering. So this test suite is related to all tests in regards to rendering. So that's the first argument. The second argument is just the callback function. And inside here is just the body of the test suite. So inside the test suite, inside our describe callback function, this is where we're going to actually define the tests. Okay, so we can do that by using the it function, or you can use the test function. And these two come from jest. Okay, so I'm going to do it, and then the name of this test. So you want to, write a unique name for this test that describes what's going on. So this is where you can say, okay, it should have homepage text. So this is where you really want to really describe what the test is supposed to do. Okay. Sometimes what I like to do before I even write my tests, I like to do something like it.todo. And this allows me to actually plan out the tests that I want to write. So then I can go back and delete the to-do part and actually implement the tests. Okay. So the name of the test, and then the second argument is a callback function, and this is where all of the logic is going to happen. This is where all the magic happens. Okay, so when it comes to writing tests for your front-end application, it's a lot different than writing tests for a server-side application. Some of you might be familiar with writing server-sided application tests. It's very, very different, but not too different. The first thing that we have to do with our front-end tests is we need to make sure we actually render the component that we are testing. Okay, so I need to go ahead and import this homepage component right over here. It's already exported from the page.js file. So I'm going to go ahead and use let IntelliSense import that for me. So first what I'll do is I'll import this render function from the React testing library package. And I don't know why it uses the require function, but I'm going to fix this. Let me just do this. Import render, and then from, and then I'm just going to copy this like that. There we go. And this is a function that we can call, and it takes in a React element. So the way that you would render your components in your React application is what we're going to do. We're going to use angle brackets like this, right? So angle brackets, the name of the component, home, and then we're going to close the angle bracket like this. It's the same way that you would render your components in your application. Okay, it pretty much takes a JSX element or a React node right over here. Okay, so this home component is imported from page. Okay, or you can just manually import it yourself if you want to. So we're going to render the component. So now that we have rendered the component, the next thing that we can do is start searching for elements in the document. Okay, as if we actually are looking at a browser and looking at the page. So what we want to do is we want to search for this homepage text, and we want to verify that that homepage text is in the document. So here's what we'll do. We're going to import this screen import from React testing library. And this screen export provides us a bunch of methods that we can call to search for text, search for literally any element you want. You can search for buttons, search for input fields, search for labels, search for tabs, whatever it is, anything. Nav bars, search for images, search for text boxes, anything. Okay, so we're going to want to search for an element, specifically a text element. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll use a method called getByText. Okay, and getByText takes in an argument, and I can specifically match the exact text that I want to search for. So if we look at the document, the exact text is homepage. So I will pass in a string literal of homepage. Okay, so what this will do is this will search for the text, and it'll return an HTML element that has this text. Okay, so it'll search for homepage, and it'll return whatever HTML element that has this homepage text, whether it's a div, a span, what else? Section, a header tag, paragraph, whatever it is. Okay, in our case, this should return an H1, a header one. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and take this part, because we're not done yet, right? We're searching for something by text, but we want to make sure that we actually write an assertion to verify that the element is actually in the document. One thing that I do want to mention is that there are many different queries. The one that we're using is part of the getBy category. So there's getByText. If you want to search for a button, you would use getByRole, and I'll explain more about that later. If you want to search for an input field, you would typically use getByLabelText. So there's getBy, there's also findBy, and queryBy. There's also 3 more that you can use to get multiple elements, but we won't talk about that right now. We'll get into that later. So I wanted to show you this chart, this table that comes from the documentation, so that way you all understand the differences when we use these different query categories. So when I use getBy, if there is no match, it will throw an error. If there is one match, it will return it. Okay, so it will return that HTML element if there is a match. If there is more than one match, right over here, it will throw an error. And it does not need to be awaited when you call the getBy method. So let's play around with this. So if I call screen.getByText, and let's just run this test right now. It should pass. Okay, there we go. It passed. Great. So we know that everything works great, and we can feel confident about our test. We don't even need to actually do anything else, because if there is no match, it will throw an error. Let's verify that. What we'll do is we can either do one of two things. I can go into the page or the home component, and I can change this text. I can completely remove it, or I can just change the text value to home pages, or I can just change the search query. I'll just do this. I'll just change the search query, and let's run this test again, and it should throw an error. See? It threw an error because it was not able to find an element with the text. Great. So that is very useful to know. So let's go ahead and actually complete this by writing an assertion, because we haven't written any assertions yet, although you could actually just leave the test like this, because we know that it will throw an error if the element was not found. But I like to write assertions because it makes our tests a lot more readable, so it gives not only ourselves but other developers a better understanding of what's going on. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll use the expect global that comes from Jest, because we are expecting this HTML element to be in the document. Let's go ahead and run the test now. And it passed. If we wanted to make sure that it is not some kind of false positive test, we can actually negate this test right over here. But if we do that, you can see that this is the nice thing about ESLint, is if I try to negate this test, it'll tell us that use queryBy rather than getBy for checking if an element is not present. Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit, but there are differences between using getBy versus queryBy versus findBy, and as we progress through this tutorial, you'll learn more about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. So let's do a couple of other things. Here's what we'll do. Let's go back to our home component, and let's go ahead and add a couple of other components. Let's add a button. Let's make sure that it's in the document, and it's over here. There's some CSS. I'm going to remove the CSS because I don't want any of that stuff right now. Okay, there we go. Cool. So let's go ahead and write a test to verify that the button is in the document. So now I will show you all how to search for elements that are buttons. So let's write a test, and we'll say it should have button with text click me. Okay, so now, like I said, before we do anything, we need to make sure we render our component. So let's render the home component, and now we need to search for the button. How do we do that? Well, earlier I did mention that we can search for buttons using the getByRole query, or you can use queryByRole or findByRole. Okay, but let's just stick with getBy for now. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and use the screen.getByRole. And one thing that I want to mention, for those who might be confused why we're using getByRole, or maybe you might be wondering, why isn't there a getByButton query? Well, you can actually create your own custom queries if you want to, but we're not going to do that right now. But I'll explain why we're using the getByRole method and why it makes sense. So in your document, right, different HTML elements could have their own roles. So the button element has a role. So if I were to actually inspect this element right over here, let me go over to my dev tools and go to this little double caret symbol, go to accessibility. You can see that right over here, underneath computer properties, it says role and it's set to button. Other HTML elements will have different roles. So like, for example, I will just simply add an input field right now. And you'll see that the role for the input field will be text box right over here. Okay. So that's just one thing that I want to mention. And this is really for accessibility, which we're not going to focus too much on or talk too much about that right now because I want to focus on the testing first. But I just wanted to mention that in case of those of you who might be wondering why exactly it's this way. Okay, so you can see that we can pass in a bunch of roles. So there are literally so many different HTML elements that have their own roles. So we can just type button right over there. Okay, so now if we want to, we can pass in options. So this is very helpful if you want to be more specific when you search for the button or whatever element by its role. So for example, our button has this click me text, and maybe you want to specify the text that the button should have that we're searching for. So I can pass in this name property, and I can pass in click me as the value. So this will search for a button that has click me as its text, which it does. Now, in this situation, we actually only have one button, so we don't even need to pass in this second argument over here because it's only going to look for one button. But in situations where you want to be more specific, you can pass in this second argument, pass in the name, and that's just going to match the text for this button. Okay, so let's go ahead and run the test, and it should not throw any errors at all, because if it did throw an error, that indicates that the button does not exist, right? Because remember, getBy queries will throw an error if the element does not exist. So if I were to remove that button completely from the document and I run the test will fail because it threw an error because it was not able to find that element by its role. Okay, if I change the text matcher to click, let's just write a bunch of random stuff. Okay, it's going to fail as well because it won't be able to find that button with that specific text. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that example. So let's clean this up by writing an assertion for this. So we'll just say expect screen, or let's paste that in there, to be in the document, just like that. Okay, and let's just run the test again. And let me actually use that test:watch script, so that way I don't have to constantly rerun this script over and over again. Rerun the test script. Every time we save or every time we modify our test or save, it'll just run the test again, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's pretty much how you search for buttons. Let's write another test to show you all how to search for input fields. I'll show you two ways on how to do that. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to give our input a label. So let's just wrap this inside a div real quick. And we need to give our input an ID. That way we can associate the label with that input. So I'll just call this random text. And then we're going to create a label. And I'll just say enter random text. That'll be the label. I'll add a space as well. And we want to use the HTML4 attribute. And we want to associate this label with this input field for accessibility. So I want to make sure it matches this ID, just like that. Okay, so now to verify that it is actually properly associated with it, if I click on this label, it will focus on the input field and I can start typing. Okay. And if you want to, look at the roles, you can see that the label has a role called label text, and the input field, of course, has its own role, which is text box. Okay, and that's pretty cool. And you can also see in the dev tools that it'll tell you which label is associated with this element, with this input element. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually search for this input field and do some stuff with it. So let's go ahead and write another test. So it should have input field with label enter random text. Okay. And one thing that I will also mention is that you do not want to combine all of your assertions in one test. It's good practice to have, typically you want to minimize the amount of assertions in a test as much as you can, especially for unit testing, because like I said, you are testing only one single thing for your component. So that's why I'm breaking everything up in its own test block. So in this test, I am testing something different from the previous two tests. So let's first render our home component. And what we're going to do is we're going to search for the input field. So there's two ways that we can do this. First, let's use getByRole. So we'll do screen getByRole, and the role that we're going to the role that we're going to use is text box. Okay, and there are options that you can specify, but you kind of are limited to that when it comes to input fields, because the input fields, there's really no text matcher that you can use to search for that. So this is only really useful if you only have one text box in the document. Okay, so it's not optimal to use getByRole for input fields, but I'll show you how this works. So if I run the test, you'll see that it does not throw an error because that input field is actually there. If I remove it, it will throw an error because it cannot find any input field where it has, it cannot find any element in a document where it has a role that is text box. Okay, so let's just, let me add that back. Cool. Okay, so now that we have the element in there, I can just write an assertion and say to be in the document. Great. Awesome. Okay, wonderful. So that's one way that you can search for an input field. So now I'm going to show you how to search for input fields and what I think is the better approach. Okay, so instead of using getByRole, we can use a query called getByLabelText. And you might be wondering, well, doesn't that imply that the label or the input field must have a label associated with it? And yes, that is true. However, it is very good practice to make sure that you have your input fields associated with a label, because it increases accessibility for your website, which is very, very good. And it's just good practice in general. Okay, now there will be some situations where you might not be able to have a label associated with an input field. So I'll show you other ways to find an input field when you can't have a label. So first, we're going to reference screen, and we're going to use the getByLabelText query. And it literally is what it says, getByLabelText. So whatever the label text is, in our case, it's enter random text : with a space. So what we can do is, instead of actually typing this whole thing out and including the space, we can use a regular expression. So I can just do // in between. I can just do enter random text. I don't even need to include the colon because, like I said, it's going to pretty much match this substring. And if we run the test again, you'll see that it does not even throw an error because it can find that element. Of course, if we just type this in, it's not going to find that element because there's no label text that matches this whole string right over here. I can even just do enter random, and there it is. Okay, so that's another way to search for label texts. So we search for input fields that are more specific based on its label text. So maybe I might have another form field, maybe like I have a username password type of situation. So maybe we'll do enter, and I'll just change this to specific text. So now I have 2 input fields, okay? And each one of these input fields has its own label. So now let's do this. Let's go ahead and copy this part. Or actually, before we do that, let me show you one more thing before we continue. So let's say if I were to go back to getByRole and I use text box, what do you think is going to happen? Well, remember, if we go back to the documentation, it said that if there was more than one match, it'll throw an error. And you can clearly see right over here, after the test reran, it threw an error. It said found multiple elements with the role text box. Okay, so that's why you want to be able to understand when to use, each query. Okay, but of course, it really takes practice and really takes getting the hang of everything to be able to know when to use which query. Which, of course, it just takes practice. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly throw that in there so that you all understand that. So let's continue with this. Let's just write the assertion. So copy this and say expect screen getByLabelText regular expression with the matcher enter random text to be in the document. Okay, that's awesome. Now, let's go ahead and write another test that's just going to be identical to the to this test that we just wrote, but just for the other input field that we wrote. So it should say it should have input field with label enter specific text, and I'll do enter specific text. I don't even need to type the whole thing. I can just do specific, and you can see that the test passes. Of course, if it cannot find this label that matches specific, then it'll throw an error. Okay? Hopefully that is pretty straightforward. There are also other ways to search for input fields as well. So let's say there are sometimes you can't associate labels with inputs for whatever reason, or maybe the label itself could be very complex to search for. So we can use a query called getByPlaceholderText. So that requires the input field to have a placeholder value. And if you're not familiar with that, I'll show you real quick what exactly is a placeholder value. So let me just go ahead, and I won't have a label for this input field, but I'll have a placeholder. And for this placeholder, I'll say search ... Okay, and let's go into the app. So we can see that we have this search field. Okay, so we don't have a label associated with this form field or this input field, but we have a placeholder text. So we can write a test to search by placeholder text to get that input field. So let's do that. So let me go ahead and do this. It should find input field by placeholder text search. Okay, so let's go ahead and render the home component. And let's go ahead and write our test. So screen getBy, and we will use getByPlaceholderText. Okay, and then we want to pass in the matcher. So I can just do search and be specific, search ... And if I run the test, it should pass. Yep, all of the tests pass. If I were to just pass in a random string, it will fail because it cannot find any input field that matches this text for its placeholder value. I can use a regular expression and just pass in search, so it'll match that search substring. So that works as well. So that's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and just write another assertion, just like that, to be in the document. Okay. So I just wanted to throw that out there. We can also use getByDisplayValue. So you can pretty much use that whenever you know an input field's value. So you can get the input field pretty much by its value. So what I mean by that is this, right? So let me create another input field. And let me actually fix this. Let me get rid of the ID over here and over here. So no placeholder, but we will set a value, and I'll just say, let's just do, we'll just type in a car. Okay, so this input field has a text value already. Let's go ahead and search for it. So let's do this. It should find input field by display value. So let's render the component just like that. And I'm just going to do this screen. We're going to use getBy, okay, display value. And we're going to pass in the matcher. So I'll just use a regular expression to match Audi. And if it can't find it, it should throw an error, but it should be able to find it. So let's rerun the test. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so the test passed, but it does give us some kind of console error. It's just talking about providing a value prop to a form field without having an on-change listener. But we're not going to worry about that for now, okay? But the test passes, which is good. Just wanted to show you all how that works. All right, so far all of our tests include assertions of elements being in the document. However, what if I wanted to write a test to verify that specific elements are not in the document? Maybe we want to verify that specific text is not in the document. Maybe we want to make sure that a specific input field is hidden or not in the document. How do we do that? Well, you might wonder, well, can't we just negate the test? So instead of, saying expect whatever this HTML element is to be in the document, we can negate it by using the not matcher. But you'll see that right over here, we actually get an ESLint error. And this is why I suggest you use ESLint, because it really points out any mistakes that you might be making. And that can really fix a lot of the broken tests or false positive tests that you might end up writing. And if you hover over this error, it will tell you to use queryBy queries rather than getBy queries whenever you want to check if an element is not present. And it might not be obvious as to why they are suggesting this, but let's try to understand this for a second. So let's go back to the documentation. If you see over here on this table, you can see that it says, actually I showed a similar table earlier, but let's recap on this. Whenever we use getBy queries, if there are 0 matches or if there's more than 1 match, it will throw an error. And if it throws an error, the entire test automatically fails. You cannot proceed. If fails, it's done. Okay? If it returns 1 match, then it'll return the element, and then the test will continue on, and it'll either pass or fail based on the assertion that you're writing. Okay? So let's say, for example, if we look at all of our tests, we can see that all we're really doing is just verifying that the element is in the document. So we can pretty much say, okay, well, if either one of these function calls were to fail, that implies that the element was not found, which also implies that it's not in the document. Okay? Now let's understand queryBy queries. Okay? So let's say, for example, if I were to use a queryBy query instead of getBy. So let's say we use queryByText over getByText. If we cannot find that text when using queryBy, or cannot find the element that matches that text, it will return null instead of throwing an error. And this is very useful because maybe you don't want the test to error out when you can't find the element, but you want to additionally write an assertion to say, hey, I know that this element is not a document, so allow it to return null, which it does if it can't find it, and then write an assertion to verify that the element is not in the document, that the element is undefined, that the element is not null, or I'm sorry, is null. Okay? If queryBy returns 1 match, it will just return the element. So if it is in fact in the document, then you can just continue on with whatever you want to do. However, I bet that ESLint will probably complain, telling you to use getBy instead of queryBy in that situation. If it returns more than 1 match, it'll throw an error. Okay? So hopefully that part makes sense, because think about it, right? we don't want the test to error out if we can't find the element. But when we use getBy, that is the case. And you saw that in many examples before when we were writing all of these tests. But if I know that the element is not in the document, I want to let it try to search for it. And if it can't find it, let it return null. And then I will myself write an assertion to verify that that element is in fact null and it is not in the document. So let's take a look at some examples. Okay, so let's go into our application and let's just modify some stuff. Okay, here's what I'll do. What I will do is I will create another section in my document, and I will go ahead and add a button, and then I'll go ahead and name this button show text. Okay, and I'll define a state variable up here called show text, and call the setter function set show text, and this will just be a Boolean value, which by default will be set to false. Okay, and I will show a specific text whenever show text is truthy. So I'll just say show text, and this is the text. Okay, let's go ahead and see what's going on. Let's see, only works on the client component. Okay, I guess since we're using Next.js, we do have to specify this use client part over here. There we go. Okay, cool. So if I were to just set this to true, you can see that this is the text will appear. Put it back to false, it will not be there. Okay, awesome. Let me also just wrap this in a span. Or let me just fix this up a little bit. Sorry about that. I meant to put this in a span, I just forgot. Okay, so show text. Okay, and then I'll add an event listener on the button. And then whenever we click on this button, we will just pretty much toggle this text. So all we'll do is we'll call set show text and pass in the negated value of show text. Okay, so this will pretty much toggle it true, false, whenever we click on the button. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. Now let's go ahead and write a test. So what do we want to test for exactly? We're going to forget about testing, if this element is in the document, like we have been for all of our other elements. But what I want to do this time now is I want to assert if an element is not in the document. Okay, so I want to assert that this text over here, this is the text, is not in the document. So let's see what happens if we try to use getBy query instead. So let's do it should not find element with text. This is the text. Okay, and let's go ahead and write the test now. So let's render out our component, and let's go ahead and do this. Let's say expect screen getByText. This is the text to be in the document. Of course, we know that this will fail because we know that when we call getByText, if the element is not in the document, it's going to throw an error. Okay, but what if I try to negate this, it's going to complain and say to use queryBy. Okay, so let's use queryBy. So let's delete this whole thing. Let's do screen queryByText. This is the text. Okay, and if we save, you'll notice that the test does not fail. Okay, and it not failing pretty much implies that queryByText is working the way we expect it to, because we know that the text is not in the document, but the test is not failing. Okay, and remember what we said earlier, when you use queryBy queries, what happens? If it can't find the element, if it does not match at all, it'll just return null. So this return value is null. So what do we do with it? Well, we can write an assertion. So let's write an assertion. Let's pass in this element. And let's just say not to be in the document. And if I save and run the test, you'll see that everything passes. Now, what happens if I try to assert that it is in the document? You're going to see that ESLint automatically complains, and it says that use getBy queries rather than queryBy for checking element is present. And of course, that makes sense because, you know, if we're using queryBy, we know that if it cannot find that element in the document, it's going to return null. So if we were to write assertions to assert that a specific element is in the document, it would make much more sense to use getBy. The reason why is because we can always guarantee that if the getBy function, or I should say query, if the getBy query call does not fail, if it does not throw an error, it implies that a match was found and it will return the element. If a match was not found, it will throw an error. Okay, so let's go ahead and put this back to this. Okay, that's great. So now that we can kind of compare and contrast the differences. Okay, so let's go ahead and write a more complex test where we actually interact with components. So, for example, I want to be able to actually click on this button and show this text, and then click on it again and have the text disappear. So let's do that. So what I'll do is, instead of putting that test inside this homepage rendering test suite, I'll go ahead and create a new test suite, and I'll call this homepage behavior, because right now we are testing the behavior of our components. Okay, and I'll actually refactor this just a little bit. So here's what I'll do. I will go ahead and remove this part. I'll copy all of these tests, and I'll put another describe block in here, and I'll label this rendering, and I'll put all of the tests related to rendering inside this test block or test suite, and I'll create another describe function call that's also inside homepage but outside rendering, and I'll call this behavior. Okay, so let's go ahead and write a test where we find this show text button, we click on it, and then we assert that the element by its text is in the document. So let's go ahead and say should find button. It should click on show text button and find new text. Okay, let's render our component. So now let's go ahead and find the button. So we know that the button is in the document. Of course, sometimes you might not know if certain elements are in a document or not. And that's why you have to figure out the logic flow of your application and the behavior of it, which is what we're doing right now. But we know that the button is there, and we can find it, and we can click on it. So let's do that. So here's what we'll do. Let's go ahead and call screen getByRole, pass in the button string, and then the name of this button, we have to make sure we do specify a name that matches the button's text, because we have two buttons in the document. So we'll just do show text, which is the name of the button. And now, what do we want to do after we get this button? Well, we want to interact with it, right? We don't need to write assertions of this button being in the document, because we already did that above already, and it has nothing to do with this test. And of course, if that button was, for whatever reason, not in the document, this would throw an error. So here's what I'll do. I'll go ahead and assign this, the return value of screen.getByRole, into a variable. So I'll call this variable show text button. And we know that it's an HTML element. And what I want to do is I want to fire a user event. And to do that, we're actually going to need to install a module that is actually part of testing library, but it does not come with it when you install it. You have to install it separately. So let's go into our terminal, and we're going to type npm-i-d @testing library /user-event. And this is a separate This is a separate part of React testing library that you can use to fire user events. And they do have documentation right over here under user interaction of the sidebar. Let's see, introduction. Yep. And they talk about user event right over here. And this is the GitHub repository, so you all can look into this if you want to. Okay, so let's go ahead and import user event. So this is how we're going to import it. Import user event from @testing library /user event. And this export from this package comes with a bunch of functions that you can call that allow you to interact with elements in the document. So I can say user event dot, and you can see that, look at all of these different things they can do. You can tab into an element, you can type into an element, for example, like an input field or text box. You can click on elements, double click, hover, whatever it is that you need. In our case, we're going to need to click on the button, so we're going to call click, and this takes in an argument element. So we're going to pass in this show text button variable, which is the button that we just found in the document. Now this method call is asynchronous, so we do need to await it. So let's first add the async keyword in front of the callback function of our test block, and then we'll await this method call. Okay, so now that we have clicked on this button, what we want to do is we want to actually verify the text is in the document. But before we do that though, let's actually verify that the text is not in a document. So we're kind of doing like a before and after. So we're going to verify, assert that the element is not in a document, and then once we find the button and click on it, we will then assert that the element is in the document. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go ahead and write an assertion, and we'll just say expect screen.queryByText, and then I think the text was called, this is the text. Not to be in the document. So we're asserting that this element by its text had no matches and it's not in the document. Let's look at what happens when we run the test. Verify everything is good. Okay, everything is good. All of our tests pass. And you can kind of see the hierarchy of our tests. You can see that we have homepage, which is the main test block over here, and inside homepage we have two describe blocks, rendering and behavior. So that's how I like to separate my tests. Of course, you don't have to do this. You can just put everything in one describe block if you want to, but I do suggest trying to practice categorizing your tests. Okay, all right, so good, we have our assertions working. Let's continue. So after we click on the button, we expect that this text will appear conditionally. Okay, because when we click on the button, it will update the state, and based on that state value, it will show the text or not. So let's do this. After we click on the button, we want to write an assertion that asserts that the text is actually in the document. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this part over here, this string literal, and I'll say expect screen getByText, pass in that string, and then we'll use the to be in the document matcher. And let's see what happens to our test. Okay, it passes, which is good. All right, now it's not always the case where elements will appear instantly or almost instantly in the document. Sometimes you might be waiting for a response from the server or a WebSocket, and then once that response has been received, then you might render some kind of element in the document. In our situation, it almost looks as if the element is appearing synchronously as we are clicking on this button. Okay, we just click on it and it appears immediately. You need to recall that state does not update synchronously in React. It actually updates asynchronously. So you're not always going to get the value that is expected. Okay, and let me show you an example of what happens if I delay the setShowText function call. So let's use a set timeout, and let's just add a timeout of 100 milliseconds, a small one, and you'll see that all of a sudden the test fails and it's not able to find this element. if I were to go into the project and if I were to click on this button, it still looks as it's acting normal, right? It still looks as if it's appearing in a document just fine. But the problem here is that React testing library is not able to get that element by its text because it's actually not in the document. It does appear eventually, but in the current state, it's not there. Okay, but there are ways to handle this, and this is how you handle asynchronous state changes in general, and this is how you can handle waiting for elements to appear in a document, because technically this element does take time for it to appear. Okay, so let's go ahead and just comment this out, and what I will do is introduce to you all the next set of queries that you could use whenever it comes to searching for elements in the document, and those are the findBy queries. So if you look at the documentation over here, you can see that we have the findBy queries. So there is findByText, findByRole, findByLabelText. All these same exact queries are all part of every single category. Okay, so all of the queries that we've been using so far, such as queryByText, there's findByText, getByLabelText, there's also findByLabelText, getByPlaceholderText, there is findByPlaceholderText, and etc. Now, the main difference between findBy is that, one, it is asynchronous and it returns a promise. So we do need to make sure we await it whenever we call any findBy query. Okay. If there are no matches, it will throw an error similar to the getBy query. If there's one match, it will return the element, of course, after you resolve that promise. And if there's more than one match, it will throw an error. Okay. And of course, remember, it's asynchronous. Okay, and it does actually retry as well. So the situations where you will want to use findBy queries is whenever you know that you have state updating asynchronously and it'll take some time for it to update, and perhaps you're waiting for some value to be updated and you want to assert that the document has the new value being displayed. That is a good time to use findBy queries. If you're waiting for, let's say, a modal to appear in the document, you want to use something like findBy. If you are waiting for a button to appear, or really any element to appear in the document, you want to use findBy queries. Okay. Now, there's also another function called waitFor. And I'll show you guys some examples about this later on. But waitFor is a way where you can wait for a period of time for your assertions to become true. Okay, so let's say you are waiting for a modal to appear, or waiting for some text to be displayed in a document. You can also use the waitFor function call as well. We're not going to talk about that right now. Let's focus on the findBy queries. Okay, so let's go ahead and now, instead of using getByText in this test over here, let's use findByText. Okay, now one thing that you have to make sure is you are in an asynchronous function, which we are already. So we can just simply do this. I can write an expect function call and pass in the awaited value of screen.findByText, and then pass in the text we want to match. And then I can say to be in the document. And if I look at my tests, it should pass. Okay. Now, it does say in the documentation by default that the timeout is 1,000 milliseconds, also known as 1 second. Of course, you can't wait, forever for an element to appear in the document. So it has to time out eventually. So look at what happens if let's set the timeout to, let's set the set show text function to be called after 1 second. Okay, the test still passes. But what if I set it to, let's say, 1100 milliseconds? Let's see what happens. See how it fails? Because it took too long to appear in the document. Now, there are ways that you can handle this. You can configure the timeout. So findByText takes in 3 arguments. So it takes in options, which we will ignore that. and it takes in wait for element options, which is where you can pass in a timeout. And what you can do is you can set a timeout to, let's say, 5 seconds. And now if I rerun the test again, it will now pass because we waited long enough for it to appear in a document. Okay, so that's how you can handle situations like this. So just remember that typically you want to use findByText when you know that it's going to take some time for an element to appear in a document. Typically longer than longer than like a couple milliseconds. Okay, if you know that an element is just going to be in a document, then you want to use getBy. Okay, and actually, in this situation, we shouldn't even have been using getByText, but I did it on purpose to show you guys the difference, right? Because we know that when we click on events, when we click on buttons in a document, we know that those actions are asynchronous. Okay, so we actually should be using findByText. Okay, let me also comment this out now and show you an example of how we can use the wait for function to handle asynchronous operations, because you will need to use wait for at some point. So what we can do is we can import this wait for function that comes from testing library /React, and then this takes a callback, and all I can do is inside this callback function I can write my assertion. Okay, so actually instead of using findByText, I could actually use a combination of wait for with screen.getByText. So let me copy this and just put this inside here, and let me just await this call. And let's actually see what happens with our test. Let's see. Now, of course, the test is going to fail because, remember, the default timeout for wait for is 1 second. So if it takes more than 1 second for it to appear, then it's just going to fail. But like I said, you can always configure the timeout. So if you look over here, wait for options, timeout. I'm not really too sure what the limit is, but like I said, over here it says the default is 1000 milliseconds. Okay, so you can always increase that. So let's do that real quick. So let's go over here and let's do timeout. Let's set it to 1200 milliseconds. So just 100 milliseconds more than it takes for the text to update. And now it passes. Okay, so notice how this time I'm using a combination of wait for along with getByText. But of course, this is not really necessary because you can just use findByText. It already does the same thing, because findByText is really just getByText combined with wait for. Okay, it even says in the document right over here. Okay, and it even tells you right over here that use findBy queries whenever you expect the element to appear, but the change to the DOM might not happen immediately. So remember, any type of asynchronous operation can cause that. Okay, so it's good practice to ensure that you are using either wait for with getBy queries or just use findBy queries. Okay, hopefully that part makes sense. All right, so now in this next example, I'm going to show you how we can pass props into components and mock out the props and change them up a little bit whenever we want to write different types of tests. So this is actually pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and create a component real quick. So I'll just go inside my source folder, and what I'll do is I'll create a new folder called components, and I'll create a new file called user profile.jsx. So this is just going to be a simple component that displays user data. So let's create our function component, and we will have it return a div. And I'll have a couple divs that will render out the props that we're going to be passing into our user profile component. So I'll have a display name prop, I'll have a username prop, email, and I'll also do a Boolean value prop. So we'll call this isEmailVerified. And I think this is probably all we'll need. Cool. Okay, so let's do that. And now let's render out all of our user information. So inside this div, I'll just wrap everything in a span. So I'll just say display name, just like that. Let's just duplicate this a couple times. So we have username and email. So username, and then email. And now let's go ahead and create another div. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and have some pretext. So I'll just say something like this. Verified. And what we want to do is, based on the value of is email verified, whether it's true or false, we're going to display different text. So if is email verified is true, then what we want to do is we want to render email verified. If it's false, we'll render email not verified. Okay. Now, before I actually continue, let me do this real quick. I'm going to remove these span tags because I want to show you what happens if I don't have the span tag at all. Okay. So, let's see. I think we're done here. Okay. Let's go into our tests folder and let's create a file called userprofile.test.jsx. And let's just create a describe block and we'll call this user profile. And then let's go ahead and create our first test and we'll just say should have text email verified when is email verified is true. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll render out our component first. So let's go ahead and import the render function from React testing library. We'll call that function, and we want to go ahead and render out the actual component, which is user profile. So we'll pass that rendered value inside the render function. Okay, so now that we have rendered out the component, we want to search for the element by text. So I'll search for the element by text where the text is email verified. Okay, but here's the thing that we're not done yet. Okay, we need to actually pass in the props first into the user profile component. So let's do that real quick. So we have display name. I'll just call this Anson the developer. Username. Anson the dev. Can't type today for some reason. Email. Anson the dev at ansonthedev.com. And then last but not least is email verified. Now, this is the part where we can, change the outcome of our test depending on what we pass into this prop over here, right? Because our test is going to assert that the element is found by its text, which is email verified. And we know that email verified is going to appear in the document when is email verified is true. So we want to make sure that for is email verified, when we're passing it into the component, we want to make sure that this value is true. Otherwise, it's going to, the test will fail when we write assertions. So now let's go ahead and find the element by text. So let's go ahead and just write an expect. And we'll pass in screen.get. Oh, we got to import screen first. Import that from React testing library. And then we'll go ahead and call getByText. Okay. And remember, we're calling getByText instead of queryByText because we are asserting that the element is in the document. If we were asserting elements that are not in the document, we would use queryByText. Okay. So we have screen.getByText. And the text that we want to search for is email verified. Okay, and we want to go ahead and say it is in the document. So we'll use the to be in the document matcher. Whoops, I messed up my syntax. What's going on here? There we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and run the test now, and let's see what happens with our test. So npm run test. Now I'm going to go ahead and specify the file name. So the file name is userprofile.test.jsx. You can also use a regular expression as well. I could just pass in user profile like that, because I only want to run this test file. Okay. Now you'll notice that the test fails. So we can see that the text is actually in the document, but it fails. It says unable to find an element with the text email verified. Okay. Now it also gives you more feedback, but the reason why our test is failing is because we are trying to match the exact string email verified that is inside an HTML element. The HTML element that is actually supposed to search for is this div, right? But we can see that the div actually does not match exactly the text email verified. The text inside this div is actually verified : new line email verified. Okay, that is the actual text of this div. So there's two ways that we can fix this. One, we can actually, instead of using a string literal, we can just use a regular expression. And if we run the test again, the test should pass. Okay, the second way that we can handle this is we could actually just wrap this text in a span, just like that. And if we run the test again, this time, instead of trying to search for the div, well, actually, it's not really searching for the div, but this time it knows that the span element is the element that has this text content over here. And actually, if I were to, let me do this. If I were to console log this and show you the outcome, it should log a span element. Yep, you can see that it logs HTML span element. Okay, pretty cool. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and write the next test where we are asserting that email not verified is in the document. Okay, so let's copy and paste this test. So this time I'll just change up some stuff. So it should say should have text email not verified when is email verified is false. And we will just pass in for the is email verified prop, we will pass in false instead of true as the value. Okay, so this time though, what I'll do is I will write two assertions. The first assertion that I'll write is I want to assert that the email verified text is not in the document. Okay, and when we write assertions to verify elements that are not in the document, we use queryBy. Okay, so I can go ahead and do screen queryByText, and I want to assert that email not verified. Actually, I'm sorry. It should be email verified is not in the document, because right now we are asserting that email not verified is in the document because we're passing in false. Okay, sorry for confusing you all. So we want to query by text email verified because we know that this text is not in the document. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and use the not matcher and then chain it with to be in the document like that. So I'm basically saying, okay, I am expecting this element that is returned to not be in the document. And that element is supposed to be associated with email verified text. Okay? Now I can see that if I run this test right now, the test should pass. There we go. And let's just write another assertion. And this time we will just assert that the element email not verified is in the document. So since we are asserting an element is in the document, we will use getBy. You could also use findBy as well, but that's not really necessary in this situation because we're not really working with any asynchronous updates to the state. So we'll do screen, screen, getByText, email, not verified, to be in the document. Okay, and let's go ahead and run the test again. There you go, it passes. Awesome. Great, that is what we want. Now, another thing that I do want to mention is that now that you know how you can, alternate the props for components that you're trying to test, you should now be able to test literally any component and be able to pass in whatever props you want to change the outcome of the test or change the way that you want to write assertions. Okay, so your user profile card, your user profile component can have literally as many props as it needs, and based on whatever props are being passed in, you can write assertions. Okay, so I could even make this a little bit more complex. So let's say, for example, maybe I might want to cut off some text if it exceeds, if the length of the text is too long. So oftentimes you might have something like a username or a display name that could be too long to display in the document without it breaking the user interface. So what I could do is this. Let's just do this. Let's say if the display name, the length is greater than, let's say if it's greater than 30 characters. Okay. If it is, I will go ahead and take the display name. I will slice it from position 0, so index 0, all the way up to, let's see if it's greater than 30. Let's slice up to 27, I guess. You know what, let's just do this. Let's slice it from 0 all the way up to 28, and then concat it with 3 dots. And if it's not greater than 30, we will just render the display name the way it is. Okay, so now let's actually render out the component. So let's go inside the home component, or the homepage component, and let's render the user profile, and let's just pass in some props. So username, Anson, I'll modify this in a second. Email, Anson, is email verified, false, and let's pass in the display name. So right now, if I render it like this, let me just add the space. There we go. Okay, yeah, so there's no ... at the end. Yeah, but if I were to just make like a really long text, you'll see that it should go all the way up to here. So what is this? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So 28 characters, and then add 3 dots at the end. So you could just do something like that. And then what you could do is you can write a test, and you can assert that the display name, this text over here, if it's greater than 30 characters, then it should end with 3 dots. Okay? If it isn't greater than 30 characters, then there should not have 3 dots at the end. Of course, that also implies that the user's display name will never have any special characters like periods or @ symbols, and most applications typically don't allow that. So let's go ahead and write a test for that before we continue. So let's do this. Let's just say it should have display 3 dots. So it should have display name and with 3 dots when greater than 30 characters. When 30 characters. Okay, so let's test that out. So let's go ahead and copy this, and let's render out the component. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and copy and paste this a couple times. That should be more than 30 characters. Okay, so now how do we write a test to verify this functionality? Well, what I could do is, well, first we need to actually find the element. Okay, now let's look at our component real quick. I know that this span is the HTML element that will have this display name with this text. So what I could do is I could do this. I could find the HTML element where it matches display name with this colon. So that way it will give me the entire HTML element, and then check to see if the text content ends with the three characters, the three dots. So let's see how that works out for us. So here's what I'll do. I will first declare a variable called display name span element, and I will go ahead and find it. So let's do screen getByText, and we'll do display name. Okay, and let's just actually run this test real quick and see if it passes or fails. So that way we know what to modify. Okay, so it passes. So it was able to find the HTML element, and we know that the HTML element is this whole span. Okay, again, there's two ways that we can handle this, right? One, I could either search for the text by using a regular expression with this display name colon part. Of course, I can't use a string literal. The reason why is because that whole HTML element does not only contain display name colon, it contains more than that. So it's not going to have an exact match. You can see that it fails. Okay, if you look over here, it's display name colon, and then it has the rest of this text. Okay, and clearly you can see that when it renders it virtually, you can see that it does end with the three dots. Okay, but we need to actually write the proper test for this. The other solution is we could wrap this whole thing in a span. Okay, but then here's a problem though. We would have to actually take this whole text, figure out which part is going to be cut off, and then add three dots in the end, which seems like it's being hard-coded, and we don't want to do that. We could add something like a test ID if we want to. Okay, but let's just continue writing the test first before we proceed, because we have something working. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So now that we found the HTML element, what I will do is write an assertion that says expect display name span element. And of course, we don't really care if it's in the document or not. We know that it is, but we want to make sure that the text content, the inner text, ends with three dots. So how do we do that? Well, this one is a little bit tricky, but what we could do is we can use the toHaveText content matcher. Okay, and like I said, what you can pass in is you can either pass in the hard-coded string. So you would have to take this whole string, figure out which part to cut off, and then add three dots at the end. But we don't want to do that because that makes it hard-coded and it's not going to be dynamic. Instead, what I think you could do that is a lot better is you can use a regular expression. So you can just use a regular expression to match the text. So we know that the display name will have any sequence of characters, so we'll just use dot asterisk. So that will match 0 or more of any character. And then we know that at the end it should have three dots. So we have to make sure we escape the dots, because in regular expressions, the dot, the period, represents any character. Okay, so we need to make sure we are escaping that, because basically what that allows us to do is have all of these three dots represented as an actual string to be matched, rather than representing any character in the regular expression. Okay, so this itself should match this. So let's run the test. So npm run test user profile. Okay, so there we go. It passes, but let's actually try to see if we can make this fail, so that we can verify that it actually does work. So I'm going to make this display name text a lot less, so it'll just be less than 30 characters. And let's run the test again and see what happens. So it should fail, And there you go. It failed because it said receive display name Anson the, and then it does not have those 3 dots. Okay, and like I said, this whole test will fail if the display name included 3 dots by itself. But, like I said, you are making the implication that the application will never have a display name where it will contain any special character. So it's really like a situational basis. Okay, but hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and write the opposite version of this test. So we're going to test to verify that the 3 dots do not end at the display name when the display name does not exceed 30 characters. So we'll just say it should not have 3 dots at end of display name when less than 30 characters. Okay, so we will render the component again, but this time I'll just switch the display name to just be Anson. And what we'll do is we'll do the same thing. We will search for the element by text. Whoops. Okay, display name span element. Okay, and then once we get that element, what we want to do is we want to make sure that it does not end with the 3 dots. So, let's see. I could just do this. I could probably just copy this. And I think if I negate this, I think it might... Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I could just negate this. So I can say expect this element not to have text content. Okay, and if I want to really clean this up, I could just take that, paste that in here, and make this one single call. But I like to keep things clean like this. So let's just leave it like that. So let's go into our test and let's go ahead and run the test and let's see if it works. So it passes, good. So we're basically searching for the element that matches this display name, a regular expression. It's able to find it. It's the span element, okay? And we can see that the text content will not match this regular expression, okay? Now, notice how if I were to remove these 3 dots over here, this, let's see, do not have text content. This should fail because it does in fact match. I think it should fail. Let me just run this real quick and verify. Yeah, because we're saying that it should not have text content, and this regular expression is going to literally match any character 0 or more times, but it does have the text content. Okay, so we know that this is working. I could also just copy this a couple more times, and it should fail as well, because it does have the text content where it has this match right over here. Okay, so we know that our test is working. And as you're writing more tests for your application, it gives you a lot more confidence that your application is working as intended. Okay, so hopefully these examples make sense. All right, so welcome back to this part of the tutorial. If you've gotten to this part, congratulations. We have covered a lot of fundamentals with React Testing Library, and we've written a lot of tests so far. But I feel like now it's time to get into a little bit more interesting topics when we are writing tests for our React components. So all of our tests that we have do not perform any data fetching at all. All the data is either just being passed in as a prop into a component, or we don't even have any props at all. We're just literally rendering text and then searching for on a screen and writing the assertions. However, there are situations where you will have components that need to make API calls, whether that API call is fetching data and rendering it on the screen, whether that API call is sending a post or put request, or some kind of request to update data in the backend. We want to be able to continue writing unit tests and covering those situations, but we also want to make sure we're not hitting the real API for our application. Because remember, when it comes to unit testing, you are isolating the component away from the rest of the application. You do not hit the API at all. You do not have a real database that the API is consuming, but it's not always the case where we can have a component that does not have API requests that need to be made. Okay, so how we handle writing tests for situations like that is we can use a library called MSW, which stands for Mock Service Worker. And this is a library that allows you to intercept requests that are being made to your API. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to create what's called a handler, and that handler will replace the entire API call with a mocked response. So, for example, let's look at this code on the right-hand side on their website. Let's say somewhere in my application, I might have a button that when clicked on, it will make a post request to /login endpoint on the API. Okay. Well, right over here inside this setup worker function call, we're passing what's called a handler. So when we call rest.post, okay, and rest comes from the MSW library, we're basically saying, okay, I want to take this whole endpoint, I want to match it to any requests that are being made to this endpoint, and I want to return a mocked response. And that mocked response is handled with this function right over here, which is the resolver function. And you can see that what's going on is they're just returning a response of username, first name that is mocked out. Okay, so in your tests, whenever you have a situation where at some point it will make an API call to /login, instead of actually hitting the real API, looking for the real API endpoint to make a request to, the service worker will come in hand and it will send you a mocked response as long as it matches that /login endpoint. Okay, so I know it can be a little bit confusing, but what we'll do is we'll set up the service worker so that way you all can at least see how this all works, and then you'll begin to understand the magic that happens over here. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with this. All right, so to get started, we will install MSW, mock service worker. So we'll go ahead into our project and we'll type npm i-d and then MSW just like that. All right, so after you install MSW, what we're going to do inside our project is we will go ahead and create a new folder and we'll call this mocks. Okay. And inside the mocks folder, we're going to go ahead and create a file called server.js. And inside server.js, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set up the server by importing the setup server function. So import setup server, and it should come from MSW node, just like that. Okay. And from here, what we're going to do is we're going to export the server. So first, let's call setup server, assign it to the variable server, and then we'll export it. Okay. And now inside the setup server function, as an argument, we're going to pass in handlers. Right now, we don't have any, so we're going to go ahead and create some. So let's go ahead and do that. So in the mocks folder, we will go ahead and create a file called handlers.js. And this is where we're going to create endpoint handlers. Basically, this is where we actually mock all of our endpoints that we need to mock. Okay, so the way we do that is first we'll import rest, and that comes from MSW. Next, I'll go ahead and create and export a variable called handlers, and this will just be an array of handlers. From here, we can go ahead and reference the rest import from MSW, and we can set up a handler. So one thing that I'll mention is that we don't have any API endpoints right now. We will be using the built-in API that comes with Next.js, because remember, Next.js pretty much is a full-stack framework. It comes with an API that you can just use. So we don't have to set up our own API. We don't have to set up a mock API. So that's very convenient. Okay? But of course, if you have your own API, then you don't need to set up the API for Next.js. So like I said before, we don't have any API routes right now, but we'll just set up one inside our handlers array, and then we'll create that endpoint. So what I'll do is I'll set up a handler for the get request. And of course, if you had other types of HTTP requests such as post or put, you would just call rest.post, rest.put. Okay, so this function will take two arguments. First argument is going to be the route that we want to handle. So we will create a route later that maps to /API/users. Okay, so that's the first argument. The second argument is a resolver function. And this resolver function is just a callback function. And this callback function has three arguments. It has the the first one is a request object. So it's similar to if you've used Express or if you've used Next.js API. These objects pretty much have similar properties. So if you wanted to get the response object, if you wanted to get the body of the request, you just do request.body. Okay. Second argument is response, which is just the response resolver. And this is actually a function that allows you to actually return a response. And then the third argument is the REST context. Okay. And you can do whatever you want inside this resolver function. You can reference cookies. So you can do rec.cookies. You can reference headers, anything you want. All we'll do for now is we will just return and we'll call this res function. And inside this function call, we're going to pass in an argument and we're going to reference the REST context, CTX. And this is where we can actually return literally anything. I can return JSON. So this is a function that we can call and pass in an object or anything that you want to return really. So if I wanted to return something like username, hello, that would work. But because this endpoint is going to simulate returning a list of users, we will return an array of users. So let's start with ID1, username, Anson. Okay, so we'll just return 1 for now. So now that we have this handler, our first handler set up, we need to go back into the server.js file. And we want to pass in this handler's array into the setup server function. Okay, but we're actually not going to pass in the array. We're going to kind of like use the spread operator to deconstruct this array. So what I mean by that is this. So first let's pass in handlers. So this is going to import that from here. But we're not actually passing in an array. We're going to pass in the result of handlers when we use the spread operator. So really that's the equivalent of just taking your handlers and just passing in like this. Okay, you don't have to do it this way. It's just this is how the documentation shows you examples on how to do it this way. But if you want to do it this way, and if it makes it less confusing, you can do it. Okay, but pretty much what we're doing is we're using the spread operator to spread it on the handlers array, and that will pretty much unpack the array. Okay, so like I said, it's pretty much equivalent to passing in single arguments like this, like 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now the next thing that we'll do is we'll integrate our server into our unit tests. So what we're going to do is inside the just.setup.js file, we want to actually perform a couple of pre-processing logic, as well as after every single test, we want to do some cleanup. Okay, so in jest, we can actually use these things called hooks. Okay, so jest has a before all function that you can call, and this function takes in a callback function right over here. Let me zoom in a little bit more, and it literally does what the function says. Okay, before all, what this means is that before every single test, it will execute whatever's inside this callback function. So it'll call this callback function before every single test. Okay, there's also the before each hook, and this will execute the callback function before each test. Okay, and then finally there is after all. After all, and then there is after each. Okay, and these are pretty straightforward. After all will execute after all tests are done, and after each will execute after each test is done. Okay, so you can use the before hooks with Jest for your tests if you want to do some pre-processing. Maybe you want to do some setup for your tests. You would do that inside these hooks. Okay, if you wanted to do some cleanup for your tests, you could do that inside after hooks. Okay, so the ones that we're going to be using are before all, after all, and after each. Okay, so inside the before all callback function, we are going to want to actually start up the server. Okay, so we're going to import the server from /mox/server, and then we're going to call .listen. So this will actually start up the mocking server for us. So this will allow us to actually use it in our tests. Okay. The next thing that we want to do is inside the after each hook. Whoops, it should be, I'm going to put this over here. Inside the after each hook, I want to actually call server.resetHandlers. And this is actually going to be useful because oftentimes whenever you're writing tests, you're going to want to actually replace your existing handlers, or maybe you might add new handlers for the current context of testing that you're doing. So for example, let me show you this example, right? Right over here, I have only one handler, and this handle is the /API/users route. And this returns an array with only one object inside there. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what if I wanted to return a different response rather than just return only, a successful response with an array of only one object? Well, in your test, you could actually set up different handlers on the fly. So even if it's not set up the way that you want it inside your default handlers over here, you can set them up in the test. Okay. And so when you do that, you probably don't want those handlers to carry on to the next test. So you want to reset them. And that's what this does. And that's what it says right over here. It resets request handlers to the initial list given to set up server call. And inside the after all callback function, this is where we want to clean up the tests, and we just call server.close. Okay? So that is all we're going to do with all of this. Okay? And like I said before, you want to make sure that inside your Jest config, which is this object over here, you want to make sure that setup files after env is set up to point to that jest.setup.js file, or whatever your setup file is called. Okay? So now let's go ahead and do the next part, which is going to be setting up our API. So inside our Next.js application, we're going to go ahead and set up just one API route, and this is going to be pretty simple. So the project is using the app router. So inside the app folder, I'm going to create a new folder called API. So inside the API folder, we're going to go ahead and create a folder called users. So this will set up our /API/users endpoint. And then we need a file called route.js inside the folder. And this is where we set up all of our handlers. So any get handlers or post handlers, we would set that up inside here. And again, I do want to mention again that this only works if you're using the app router. Okay, if you're using the pages router, you want to make sure you are doing it the old way. Okay, which is basically where you have your API folder inside your pages folder. So there's this example that I'll just kind of show you all real quick. So you can see over here that this is a Next.js project. It has the old pages router, so it has this pages folder over here. and then they have their own pages over here. But then for the API section, they have the API folder, and this API folder has a folder called people, and then it has these two files to set up the handlers. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So I just wanted to mention that very quickly before anyone who is following along with this tutorial and setting up the actual API route in Next.js gets a little bit confused. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up our handlers for this now. So inside our route.js file, we are going to export a function. So let's do export, and we'll make this an async function. And because we are handling a GET request, the async function that we are going to call this is get. Okay, so this is a named function that we are exporting. And Next.js will look for these specific functions inside the file. Okay? If you wanted to handle a post request, you would export a function called post. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, the argument that the function receives is the request object. Okay? And then what you can do here is you can actually handle the request. So, for example, if you want to reference cookies, headers, whatever it is that you want to do, you can just do rec dot and then reference it however you want. Okay? But all we're going to do here is we're just going to return a response. And we can do that by referencing next response. And that is imported from next/server. And then we can call this JSON function. And then we can return whatever we want. So I'm going to return an array of users. So I will do ID and then username, Anson. Okay. And I'll return a couple more. So let's do 2 and then 3. And then we'll do, let's see. And then, okay. Pretty straightforward stuff. So now let's go into our browser and let's actually test out this endpoint. So let's go to localhost port 3000 /API/users. And there we go. It returns the JSON response right over here. Okay, so now what we will do is we will do some data fetching in our application, but we will be doing data fetching on the client side. So what we will do is we will use a useEffect hook, and inside that callback function in the useEffect hook, we will use the fetch API to fetch data from our API, and then we will update some state. Okay, so let's go into our project, and what I'll do is I'll create a new component called user list.jsx, and I will create the function component, and I will go ahead and set up a useEffect hook, and the dependency array will be an empty array. And what I'll do is I will reference fetch, and then for the API URL, since we are just fetching our own internal API, we can just pass in /API/users. Okay, and keep in mind that whatever endpoint that you're passing into your fetching library, it has to match the handlers right over here. So if I wanted to be more specific and specify the domain, so localhost port 3000, then I need to do the same thing for my handler right over here. Otherwise, MSW will complain about it and it will say that it did not match any of the network requests. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and fetch this data, and then this will give us back a response, and then we need to call res.json to actually get the request or the response body. Okay, and then inside the next chain promise is where we get the actual data. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and call set users, which we have not defined yet, but this will update the state. So up here, I will define my state variable users, and then the setter function set users, and then we will call useState, which will just be an array. Okay, so now let's go ahead and render out this list. Okay, so what I'll do is this. Let's say if there are no users, so if users.length is greater than 0, we will render out the actual users list, and if it's not, we will render out a text that says no users. So users.length greater than 0, we will reference users.map, and then pass in the function, the mapping function. And this is where we will transform our user data into JSX, and that will be rendered on the DOM. So I'll just render user.username, and then when users.length is not greater than 0, we will just say okay, and then let's just pass in a key, which will be the ID of the user. Okay, so now let's go into the components, the homepage component right over here. And I will just go ahead and render out user list just like this. And it should render out both or all three of the users. I had 3 users, okay? Which is right over here. Anson, Jack, and Mike. If I refresh the page, it'll appear over there. Cool. All right. Now, next, what we're going to do is we're going to write some tests for this user list component. Now, like I said, I know that some people will be wondering, why am I fetching my data like this? Because I could be fetching everything on the server side. Don't worry about that for now. We're going to cover client-side fetching, because I know there are people who are using Vite or other tools to set up React only on the client side, and they want to be able to know how they can set this up, so that way they can handle their client-side data fetching. Okay, so don't worry about that for now, because the outcome of how you write your tests will differ based on how you fetch your data. Because the way that we're going to write our tests now is how we handle data fetching on the client side. The way that we would write our tests when we fetch data on the server side is going to be very, very different. Okay, so let's go into our test folder and let's create a new file called userlist.test.jsx. And then what we'll do is we will set up a describe block, and we'll just say user list rendering. Okay, and then we're going to set up our first test. And what exactly do we want to test for? Well, keep in mind that, remember, we're not hitting the real API, we're hitting our mocked API. So our mocked API includes only one object returned from the array that returns from the server. So I guess I'll just write a test that says it should, let's see, it should have text Anson. It should have text Anson. Okay, there we go. So of course we need to render our component first. Let me fix that real quick. There we go. And we want to render user list. And remember, user list does not have any props, so we don't need to worry about that. Okay, so now what? Well, now the next thing is you want to write some assertions. But before we do that, let's actually run the test. And let's see what happens when we do that. So let's run npm run test. And I'm going to specify the user list file or regular expression. So this will match user list.test.jsx. So now you're going to see that we actually get an error, and it complains about a couple things actually. But you see the first thing that it says is fetch is not defined. Okay, and basically the reason why this is happening is because we don't have the fetch polyfill. So we're going to install a package called whatwg-fetch. And this is actually a polyfill that allows you to inject into your application. And what you can do is you can use this to pretty much It doesn't really like mock out fetch, but it pretty much allows you to bring fetch into your application. Okay, so let's just copy this. I already have it installed already, but what I'll do is I'll just type npm i-d wg what wg hyphen fetch, just like that. Okay, and that will install the polyfill for you. And then what you want to do is you want to go inside your setup file, and in my case, it is my jest.setup.js file, and I'm just going to import what wg hyphen fetch. Okay, and now if I run the test again, we should not get that error at all. So the test actually passed, but we do see that we have this error happening, and I'm not too sure what is going on with this, because I have actually tested this out before, and in another branch, for some reason, it is not giving this error, or this it's not giving me this error in the other branch, even though I have like the same exact setup. But with this, we do, which is, again, it's very strange. I gotta look more into this, but for now, you can just ignore this because your test still passes. Okay, which is what we care about. All right, so now that we know that this works, what we want to do now is want to write some assertions to verify that we actually have the correct data that is being rendered out. Okay, so let's go back to our handlers and just see what we are returning. We are returning username Anson. So what I will do is I will write an assertion, and I will search for an element called, whoops, got to import screen, and we will search for text Anson, and let's see what happens. So let's run the test again. Okay, so we actually get an error, and it's saying that it's not able to find an element with the text Anson. Now notice how over here it says no users. So you can see that right over here we do get the element rendered out, which is good. It gives us some good feedback. It says no users though. So the problem here is that we actually are waiting for the server to give us back some data. Okay, and we can't just assume that the data is there immediately, because it takes some time for the server to render it out, because now we are hitting an API. So instead of using getByText, we're going to use findByText, because remember, findByText is used whenever you want to search for elements that you know are not going to be in the document immediately. Okay, so we're going to call findByText, and this has to be awaited, so we will add the async keyword in front of the callback function, and let's see if that fixes our test for us. Okay, there we go, it passes, and magically that error went away. I'm not too sure why this errors out when you don't have an assertion. Very strange. I'm not too sure, but yeah, it's very weird. Anyways, so we know that our test passes, and we basically used findByText instead of getByText. Okay, because findByText will pretty much wait for the element to appear in the document. Okay, if we didn't want to use findByText for whatever reason, and we wanted to only specifically use getByText, then what I could do is I can use a combination of wait for with getByText. So we still need an async function. So let's use wait for. Whoops. And then inside this wait for function, we will do this. We will expect screen getByText Anson to be in the document. Okay, and let's go ahead and run the test and see what happens. Passes. Okay, but of course you don't need to do all of this, because findByText literally is just getByText with wait for combined together. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, let's write a couple more tests as well. So we can also write an additional assertion. We can assert that the text no users is not in the document. So we can use the queryByText query, because whenever you are asserting elements to not be in the document, you want to use queryBy. And what we'll do is we'll just say not to be in the document. And let's find out what happens when we run our tests. And you can see that it works, and that is wonderful. Okay, now what happens if I actually move this up one before the findByText? I want to show you guys what happens if I do that. You can see that it fails. Okay, now you're probably wondering, well, why does it fail? Well, of course, order matters, because before we even try to search for the text, we are trying to assert that no users is not in the document. Remember that we are fetching the data from the client side, so it's going to take some time for the network to respond with the data. And the document does actually have no users in the document. Okay, if you refresh the homepage, you can see first it renders no users, then it renders all three of the users from the API. Okay, so when you try to assert that no users is not in the document before you do anything else, well, of course it is in the document, so that test will fail. But if you assert that the text Anson is in the document, what you've done already when you use findByText is you are waiting for the element to be in the document, and then you are asserting that no user is not in the document. So the order does in fact matter. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so let's write a couple more tests. This time what I'll do is I will modify our handler for API/API/users, and I'll make it so that instead of having it return only one object, I'll have it return two objects. So I'll show you how we can do that, because it's very helpful for us to mock out responses on the fly in our tests. So let's go ahead and write this. We'll say it should have username Mike rendered. Okay, so you can see that right now, of course, we don't have any object that returns a username of Mike. So if we were to write a test, so let's just do this. Let's render out the user list. Let's add async in front of this callback function. And if I were to run this test, you'll see that's going to fail, of course, because it cannot find Mike in the document. Okay, we only have Anson. All right, well, how do we update our handler so we can have it return Mike? Of course, there's two ways, right? One, I could just add Mike manually in our default handler that we set up, but sometimes you might not be able to always want to, or sometimes you might not want to always, just manually add stuff to your default handlers. So what you can do is you can modify your handlers whenever you want. So before we render out our user list, I can go ahead and reference the server. So that'll import that from the server, the mocks folder right over here. And then we can call server.use. And this is where you can actually pass in a handler. And all it does is it prepends given request handlers to the list of existing handlers. So in other words, it'll actually add it to, I believe, the front of the list. So it'll override all the other handlers. Okay. And earlier I did mention the purpose of the after each hook, where we call server.reset handlers. And all it does is it just resets the request handlers to the default list that we provided, which is right over all defined inside this handlers array, which we pass in to setup server as an argument. So hopefully that makes sense. So this will basically reset all of the initial handlers that we set up in the beginning. Okay. So now all we'll do is we'll just pass in REST, which is imported from MSW library. And then we'll go ahead and do rest.get, and then the path will be /API/users. And then we need the resolver function to mock out the response. So the first argument is going to be the request object. The second argument will be the response. And then the third is the context. And then I'll just return. So I'll call response. So res, whoops. And then pass in ctx.json. And then what I'll do is I'll just pass in, let's do ID2, username, Mike, just like that. Okay, so now watch what happens. If I run the test right now, let's see what happens. There we go. So we can see that it says should have the username Mike rendered, and it is in fact in the document. Of course, if I changed the username over here, it will fail. And it will show you that the HTML over here is Mike's with an S, but we're trying to find Mike, which of course is not in the document. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. Okay, and then of course after the test is finished, it will call reset handlers. So this will no longer be part of the list of default handlers that we initially set. So let's say in the next test, right over here, if I don't modify the list of handlers at all, and if I try to run this test, it's going to fail. Okay, see how this second one passes over here, but then the third one, the last test that we just copied and pasted and removed the server.use logic, it fails because it cannot find it because it only has Anson. So hopefully this gives you a visual understanding of how everything is working behind the scenes. All right, so I will show you all one last example with writing some tests. This time what we'll do is we will have a form, and when you click on the submit button, it will make a post request. Okay, so let's go ahead into our application. Let's create a new component, and we'll just call this register form.jsx. Okay, or actually, you know what? Let's call this a login form instead. Make it nice and simple. So let's go ahead and create the function component. And then I'll return a form. And then I'll go ahead and have two input fields. And then we'll just have a simple username and password. For the ID, I'll set the ID to username. And then the ID for this field will be password. Okay. And let's go ahead and associate our input fields with some labels. So we have to pass in the ID that we want to associate the label with. So the ID of this input field is username. So HTML4 will take in the username as a value. And then I'll just call this username. And then we'll do the same thing for password. Password, and then changes to match the ID. Okay, let's go ahead and render out the component. I'm rendering everything in the home page. It doesn't really matter all that much because we're just writing this for testing purposes. There we go. We have both of our input fields. Let's go ahead and add a button to our field. So let's do this. Button, login. All right, and I think the other thing that we'll have to do is just register an event listener on this whenever we click on the button. So let's do that. So let's do on click handle login. We'll go up here and we'll define that function. So if I go here, notice how it refreshes. That's because it's doing the default behavior. So I need to go into here. We need to get the event object and call e.preventDefault. Okay, and now it won't do that anymore, which is what we want. Okay, cool. Next, we will define some state variables. So let's go ahead and create one for username. And then one for password. Set password. Okay, and whenever we modify our username input, we will listen. Well, first of all, we'll listen to the onChange event. And then we will update set username with e.target.value. Okay. We'll do the same thing for the password field, but we'll call set password instead. I'll set the value of password, or set the value of our input field password to the state variable password, and we'll do the same thing for username. Cool. Okay, awesome. Next, what we want to do is write some logic. So let's do this. Let's say, for example, whenever we click on this button over here, actually, you know what? Let's make this a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and create a function called isDisabled. And this function will basically calculate a Boolean value that determines if the button should be disabled or not. So the user should not be able to click on the button unless if they filled out the username and password field. So all we can do is we can just say it is disabled if there's no username and there's no password. And then all we can do is we can just go over here to this button element, and we can just use the isDisabled, or no, disabled attribute. And then we can just call isDisabled just like that. So if you look at our form now, the button is disabled. Or actually it should be, we should be using the OR operator if there is no username or if there's no password. Using the AND operator, we'll check to see if both of them are not defined. Okay, but now if I type in something for username but nothing for password, the form button will be disabled, but if I type something for both, then it will be disabled. So I'm only doing this because I can make my test a lot more, I can use this to create more meaningful tests for our application. Okay, but we won't make things that complex. All we need to do now is just make a post request to some API endpoint. In our case, we will make a request. So we set the method to post, body to username, password, just like that. And then that's all we'll do. And then, of course, we need to handle the response that is returned from the server. So let's just do this. Just.json. And then we can do whatever we want. We can update some state. So let's do this. So what I'll do is I'll create a variable called, let's see, error. This is error, set error. Use state. This will be undefined. Okay. Actually, you know, we'll make it a string. All right, and I think when it succeeds, what we want to do is we want to display, let's see, let's do a success message. Okay, and what we want to do is this. I want to go ahead, and whenever the response is successful, I'll go ahead and call set success to success logging in. If there's an error, I'll say set error, error logging in. Okay, and of course the API call will error out if the server responds with any kind of 400 status code or 500 status code, and it'll succeed if it returns with a 200, 300 status code. And when I say that, I mean like 400, like in the 400 range, like 400, 401, 403, 404, 409, similar to the 200 status code, 200, 201, 204, etc. Okay, so what I want to do here is this. I want to render out these messages somewhere. Before we proceed though, let's make sure we clear out these messages before we even submit the form. Okay, so that way it's not staying in the document when it shouldn't be. So let's go over here, and I'll just very simply render out these error messages over here. Or I'll do this instead. Is error or error. Like that. And then I will do the same thing for success. Okay. Cool. Okay, so now we can actually do a couple things. So we don't actually even need to set up the API route because that'll take some more time. What's going on over here? What's going on with... Oh, I forgot to pass the URL. Whoops, silly me. The URL should be /API/auth. Okay. Good thing we picked that up. Did that fix it? Okay, so I just checked the documentation for fetch. So it seems like I need the URL to be the first argument right over here. And then I can leave the rest like this. And also, I needed to stringify the body, the request body. Okay. And I think it parses itself and then sends it to the server. So let's go ahead and continue now. So what we'll do is we'll just create a quick little auth route. And then I'll create a route.js file inside there. And I'm just going to copy and paste this. But instead of exporting a get function, we're going to export a post function. Okay. And then what I'll do here is I want to get the request body. So to do that with the app router, when you're using the app router, we're going to go ahead and await rec.json like this. And then we can console log the return value of that. So if I go over here, if I send that to the server, it is a successful response, which is good. And if I look at the logs, you'll see that I have username and password. And if I reference username like that, it should just work just fine. Okay, though I am a little bit confused as to why I need to use stringify, but I don't think I need to. Let me just double check that real quick. Okay, well, it gave me a 500 error. And you can see that over here is unexpected token in JSON at position 1. So I guess it doesn't work that way. I would have to look at the properties that the app router's request object has. But for now, we won't worry about it. We'll just leave it like this. Okay? And plus, in most situations, you probably won't even be using the fetch API anyways. So don't worry so much about that. Okay, so notice how now it says success logging in. Okay, and of course this is set to happen all the time if we have any 200 or 300 status code, and it'll fail if it returns a 500. So then it will say error logging in. Okay, so what we can do now is we can write tests and we can create our own handlers to return different status codes whenever we want. So let's go ahead and look at a couple examples of that. So inside my test folder, I've created a LoginForm.test.jsx file. And let's go ahead and write some tests. So first, let me just import the render function from @testing_library/React. And we'll also need the screen function as well. So let's import that. And then we'll set up some unit tests for our login form. So what I want to test for is I want to search for two elements. Okay. First, I want to search for the username input field, and then I want to search for the password input field, which we both know how to search for elements that are input fields already. And then next, I want to type stuff into those input fields, and then I want to click on the login button. Okay, we're going to skip all of those other tests that we wrote that deals with asserting elements in the document, because right now the tests that we are writing are pretty much like integration tests. We are testing the whole component, making sure we see how things behave with one another. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and create a test, and I'll call this it should, let's see, it should enter and password and click on login button. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in the callback function. Now we have to render our component. So let's render out the login form. Let's see. Yes, I did export this. Not sure why it is not coming up. Oh, that's quite interesting. Not sure why that was not picking up in my IntelliSense. But anyways, that's okay. So let's render the login form, and let's go ahead and find the username and password form field. So what we'll do is we will just use the getBy query, because these fields appear in the document already. They don't need to wait for, you know, some kind of API response to dynamically appear. They're just there. Okay, so we can use getByText, or I'm sorry, not getByText, getByLabelText. getByLabelText. And then we need to pass in the label text that are associated with each one of these form fields. So username is one of them, and password is the other one. So I'll just use the regular expression to match them. Okay. Or I could have also just done username colon and a string literal. It's up to you on how you prefer to do it. Okay. Now, if you want to assert that the element is in the document, I would suggest you do that in a different test, preferably one that has to do with rendering, because we know that this element will be in the document. And even if we wrote an assertion to verify that it is in the document, it kind of doesn't have anything to do with our main test over here. You want to, like I said, you want to keep your tests simple, concise, clean, simple. You don't want to go too far off topic with what exactly it is that you're trying to focus on in your test. Okay? But anyways, so what we're going to do is we're going to get this label, and then we want to actually simulate an event, specifically a user event. So we're going to need to import user event, okay, from testing library user event. And then what I want to do is I want to reference user event, and then I can call literally any function I want over here. The one that we want is type, the type function. That is to type stuff into the input field. Okay, so I will go ahead and call that function, and we need to, of course, pass in the element as the first argument. So I'll just take this screen.getByLabelText. And then now I need to pass in a second argument to type whatever I want. So I'll just say ansyn. And this is an asynchronous method call, so we need to await this. Okay. We will do the same thing for the password form field. So we will go ahead and search for the element by label text. That label text is password, and we are typing in whatever we want. So I'll just type in password. Okay. So now, this is one assertion that we could write. We could assert that the login button goes from disabled to enabled. Now the button is disabled by default. That's because if we don't have anything entered into the form fields, the button will be disabled. But once we enter text into both form fields, then it will not be disabled. So what I can do is I'll search for the button, and we're likely going to be reusing it again. So I'll store that in a variable. So I'll go ahead and say login button equals screen getByRole, and then that role is the button, and then I believe the text of that button was login. So we can just specify the name and have it match that text. Okay, but of course, you know, we only have one button in this login form component, so we can even just do this without needing to specify the name, and it will be able to search for that button. Okay, so now let's do this first. Let's write an assertion for the button, and we'll say we will expect this button to be disabled. Okay, and this allows you to check if the button is disabled. We know that it should be when there's no text inside the username field and the password field, or the password field. So they both have to be, both of those input fields must have text in it in order for the button to be enabled. So after we type 2 times, once inside the username field and once inside the password field, we can then write an assertion to assert that the button is enabled. So we can do expect login button to be enabled. Now let's run our test and see what happens. So npm run test and then LoginForm. So it passes, which is good. If you want to verify that you don't have any false positives, what you can do is you can assert that this button is disabled after you type inside the username and password field. And it should fail because the button should in fact be enabled. And you can see it fails. It says expect element to be disabled, but it tells you received element is not disabled. So that's good. Okay, let's leave that assertion. All right, so now what we will do is we will go ahead and click on that button. But before we do anything else though, we need to make sure we have a handler set up for that API call, because remember, when that button is clicked on, it's going to send a post request. Okay, so we need to make sure we go inside our handlers and we set up a handler for that endpoint. So the endpoint was a post endpoint. The path was /API/auth. And I'll just go ahead and copy this resolver function and modify it. And all it did was it just returned, it didn't really return anything significant, just some JSON in the actual API endpoint that we set up. Right over here, we just return an empty object. So what I'll do is I will just return, I guess, a status code. So ctx.status, and you just pass in whatever status code you want. So I'll do 200. Okay. Now let's go ahead and go back to our test, and let's click on the button. So we'll use the user event. I don't know what's going on with my keyboard today. User event. So wait, user event dot click. Pass that button there. And then what we will do is let's just run the test and see what happens. Let's just make sure that there are no network issues with our component. Okay, there we go. So it's able to call the API, the mocked API, just fine. If I were to remove this handler, it's gonna say, should say something like cannot post. Let's see. Yeah, so actually, it still seems like it still passes, but we do get this warning from MSW, and it says, warning, capture a request without a matching request handler. Okay, so although it passes, does not mean that it is doing what we want it to do. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to write some more assertions, because after we click on that login button, some stuff happens, and it depends on your application. Okay, in our situation, whenever the API returns with a successful status code, we will render the success message, and that success message is success logging in. So what I'll do is I'll write an assertion that that verifies that that element is in the document, or the element by that text is in the document. So we'll write expect, and let's see, screen getByText to be in the document. And let's see what happens when we do this. Okay, so notice how it fails, right? Now actually it's failing not because of, let's see. Well, it's actually failing for a different reason, because you can see right over here that it says error logging in, but instead it should be success logging in. Though I'm not too sure why that's the case. REST.post API auth. Okay, so I found out why it was throwing that error, or why it was rendering the error message instead of the success message. The reason why is over here, the way that we are handling our response from the server is we are calling res.json. So that implies that the response includes JSON. Okay, of course, if it fails, it will throw an error over here, and that's why it called set error instead of resolving and then going on to this chain promise over here, or this chain.then to call set success. So what I did inside the handlers.js file, or what I will do, instead of just calling ctx.status, what we can do instead is we can just call JSON. And what I will do here is I will go ahead and just return an object, just like that. Okay. Let's go back into our test. And if I run that test again, it should now pass without any issues. Let's see, still seeing. Okay. All right, so this is okay. Let's see. So the divs are being rendered. But let me see what's going on here. Res ctx JSON. Okay, success logging in. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on. It's kind of weird. Okay, now it passes, which I guess maybe did I not save? I guess I probably didn't save something. Okay, so now it passes, which is good. So what I can do is I can just change this text over here. Okay, now it failed. So that's very strange. I'm not sure why it's failing though. So sometimes it fails, sometimes it passes. So it's very likely that this is failing because we're using getByText. And I wanted to do this to see if it failed. But the thing that's weird is that sometimes it passes, sometimes it fails. So I think what's going on is that it takes different amount of time for the mock API to return the response. So sometimes it'll return the response fast enough for the element to just appear like instantly, and sometimes it'll take a little bit longer. And keep in mind that we're talking about milliseconds here, which can make a huge difference. So I think sometimes it's succeeding, sometimes it's not. So what we can do is we can just get rid of this entirely, and we can use let's use wait for. So let's do await wait for, and then we'll do expect, and we'll do let's see, screen getByText success logging in to be in the document. So this should now pass every single time, I believe, but of course the default timeout is 1 second. Did we not import wait for? Okay, there we go. So if we need more time to wait for the element to be in the document, we can just add a timeout, but this should pass every single time. Okay. And let's just change up the text real quick and see what happens. It should just time out, and it won't be able to find the element. Yep, so you can see that it is definitely in a document, but it was not able to find it. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So yeah, we want to make sure we are handling asynchronous updates to the state with the correct queries. Okay, so hopefully all of this makes sense on why it was failing and sometimes it was passing. Okay, but we can see that everything works great, so that's good. Now, let's go ahead and write another test. This time, we want to assert that error logging in is being displayed. So that means that we need to modify our handler to have it return a status code that errors out. Okay, so let's just do this. Let's change this to it should enter using password. Actually, I'm going to change to it should log in user and display error message. Okay. The same thing is going to happen with all of our logic. We're not really going to be changing all this stuff at all. Only difference is we're going to modify the handler. So we'll call server.use, and we're going to import rest from MSW. Okay, these two are imported up here. And then we're going to go ahead and modify the post request /API/auth. And then set up the resolver function. So we'll call res and we'll pass in ctx we'll pass in a status of 400, and we don't need to pass in the JSON because when we use fetch, if it returns a 400, it will just go automatically. It will just reject that promise, and then it will go inside this catch. Okay, and then it will call set error. So that's all we need to do. And now the only thing that we will change is, instead of asserting that success logging in is in the document, we will assert error logging in is in the document. Okay, let's go ahead and run the test now. And it should pass, which is good. If I were to change this to success logging in, and if I run the test, you'll see that the test will fail. And you can see that the actual element that appears is the text error logging in right over here. Okay, if I were to change the status to, well, remember, we can't do context.status, ctx.status, because we need to resolve the JSON. So I can just do ctx.json. And then if I run the test again, it should fail. And it will say success logging in instead. Okay, so hopefully all of that makes sense, and hopefully you understand how we can write tests like these using the mock service worker, simulating events by typing into input fields, clicking on buttons, and then waiting for elements to appear in the document. Okay, so I believe that is going to be all for this whole tutorial. I know this tutorial was about 3 hours long. If you watched the whole thing, I give you a lot of credit because we did cover a lot of stuff. Okay, I will be making more videos regarding writing unit tests, integration tests, and I will be making videos on how you can write end-to-end tests with Cypress, and we'll be using, of course, React and some backend for the project. Okay, so that will be all. If you all need any additional help with these concepts, feel free to check out the Discord server that is linked in the description. You'll be able to go there and ask for help and ask any questions, and someone will get back to you. Okay, so thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Peace out.